Okay, guys, I am Bobby J. Mullenix with Crash Training Solutions, and welcome to episode number 2 of the Crash Training Podcast. This one is called Time and Distance. It's in the bank, and you'll notice that "it's in the bank" is in quotation marks there. If you're watching along on the video podcast on YouTube, if not, you're just gonna have to trust me that "it's in the bank" is actually in quotation marks, and I'm not trying to lead you astray or anything like that. I promise you, in the 29 seconds that I've been talking to you, I haven't lied to you a single time just yet. So, why is "it's in the bank" in quotation marks exactly? It's not because we're going to start doing, giving out financial advice along with reconstruction advice, but I'm going to kind of give you a very simple way to think about time and distance as it relates to a person's, finances, financial choices, things like that. Because there is a something that just about every adult on the planet is going to be able to relate to, and that is money. Everybody has went in and they have had to buy something in a store. They've had to balance a checkbook. They have had to do something with some kind of financial, finances, adding, subtracting money, whatever the case may be, and they are familiar with the basic process of buying something. What people are not familiar with, and this is even, for crash investigators, they're not familiar with time and distance. And time and distance is almost becoming a lost art in reconstruction, in my experience, in my opinion, because it is one of those things that is very difficult to kind of get a grasp on. So hopefully a lot of you out there today are going to have that light bulb moment through this podcast, and you're going to kind of be able to think about this a little bit differently to where it's going to make a little bit more sense. And a really good thing about trying to relate time and distance to money and finances and things like that is it's also something that you can easily explain to somebody else at that point. A lot of times reconstructionists have a gist, they understand time and distance, they can calculate it, they can get to the right conclusions, they can get the right numbers and all that, but when it comes time to explain it to somebody else, they kind of fall short because it is a difficult concept to grasp even for an investigator. It's also a very difficult concept to start trying to explain to people. I remember when I first started as a reconstruction instructor, time and distance I could do and I was very good at, but I was even kind of falling short a little bit in the explanation of it and trying to get others to be able to understand the same things and the same concepts I was trying to relate to them. So this is kind of the way I figured out how I can explain it to other people and how they can kind of understand it a little bit easier. So to kind of see how this works with a rec, let's just kind of look at a financial example, by itself, and let's leave the rec out of the equation just for a second. So let's take this guy for example, and we're going to we'll call this guy Steve. So we've got Steve here, and Steve woke up this morning, and he logged on and he checked his bank account, and he saw that he was $600 richer because he got his COVID-19 stimulus direct deposited into his account. So now Steve has $600 that he wants to spend on something. So Steve starts thinking about it a little bit, and Steve decides that he really would like to have a new laptop. So we've got Steve, he's got a $600 budget, and he wants to go out and he wants to look for this new laptop. So Steve goes out and he wants to take his $600 stimulus and he wants to turn it into this laptop that he finds. And we know that he's got $600 that he can spend, and we're going to say that the laptop that he finds that he wants to have is going to be $700. All right, so now can Steve purchase that $700 laptop with his $600 stimulus? So let's find out. So we take his $600 budget, we subtract the $700 that the laptop cost, and he winds up with a $100 deficit. All right, so he is still in the red for $100. So can Steve buy his laptop? No, Steve can't buy his laptop because it cost a $100 more than what Steve has. So if Steve wants that laptop, he's got to do a couple of things. He's got to figure out how to make this number higher, or he's got to find a laptop and make this number lower. Only things he can do. He's got to increase his budget, the money he has to spend, or he has to decrease the price of the laptop that he's wanting to purchase. All right, so if Steve goes out now and on his second attempt, let's say that Steve still has his same $600 to spend, but now he finds a laptop that is only, $550. Can Steve buy the laptop? And of course, we know that he can, because now he has $50 left over. So not only did Steve buy the laptop, but Steve got some change back. So that's important to kind of make that distinction. And I know a lot of you are probably kind of scratching your heads trying to figure out how this is going to relate to a car crash, but we're going to get there in just a second. But if Steve goes to make his purchase and Steve's card gets declined at the register because he doesn't have enough money in his account, like with the first laptop, he still needed $100 to make the purchase, then the wreck is still going to happen. And if Steve can go to the register and he can purchase his laptop and he gets change back, then the wreck, didn't happen because Steve still had a surplus. And the surpluses we're usually going to be dealing with, or the budgets we're going to be dealing with in wrecks, is going to be related to time and distance usually. So if we apply this same exact scenario to a car crash, it's going to work the same thing. Let's say that we've got, we're going to say this guy's name is Carl. And we're going to say that Carl is trying to cross the street, and we're going to say that a guy named Rick is driving an SUV, and he is driving in the path of Carl. And it doesn't really matter if Carl, crossed illegally or not. Carl still has a need. He needs to not get hit. And the driver of the SUV also doesn't want to hit Carl. So it's the same thing as kind of making that purchase. All right, if Rick is the consumer, Rick is going to try not to hit Carl. So that's the product that he wants. He wants to be able to come to a stop in this situation or this collision to avoid the collision. All right, Carl wants to get across the street without getting hit. Rick wants to be able to drive down the road, of course, without running over Carl. So when we think about it like products, it makes it a little bit easier. Now we're not having this weird time and distance thing that we're trying to come up with. We've got two people, and they're pretty much in a negotiation at this point. It's kind of like these two guys got together. They've Carl or Rick, one of them is going to try to sell an item off Craigslist. And he meets the guy, at one of these safe spots for, picking up things off the internet that you purchase. So he goes to one of these safe meeting spots, and now the two are going to haggle over the price. There's going to be some kind of a negotiation between the driver of the vehicle and the pedestrian in this case, but of course it can be another vehicle, whatever the case is, a motorcyclist, bicyclist, pedestrian, whoever the two actors or the two people are that are engaged in this crash. They're going to have a little negotiation back and forth to try to see how they can avoid the wreck or how they can keep that wreck from happening. For this situation, Carl and Rick both basically want the same thing. They want the wreck not to occur. All right? Carl doesn't want to be hit. Rick doesn't want to hit him. They've just got to figure out a way to come together and kind of make that happen through that negotiation we're going to look at. But with the earlier example, of Steve getting his stimulus and going, to Best Buy or whatever and trying to buy that laptop, that's a little bit different of a situation because Steve checked his bank account. Steve saw that he had $600. He knows what his budget is. And he also went into the store. The items are clearly marked. And he saw one laptop for $700 and he saw one laptop for $550. And he knew that he's $100 short on one, and he can purchase the other one and have, $50 left over. So those variables are easy to see. For our crash scenario, the variables aren't going to be quite as easy to see. We're going to have to figure them out by doing a little bit of math. So for this example, to kind of show you how this works and give you an idea on how to relate this to the whole, finance thing, I'm going to use the patented world-renowned method of rectal extraction and pull out some variables, and we're going to kind of walk through this scenario. So let's say that we've got Carl up here. All right, and we're going to say that Carl stepped off the curb, and we're going to say that Carl walked 12 feet, and then we're going to say that Carl got struck by Rick. All right, and we're going to say that when Rick struck Carl, we're going to say that he had a speed of 35 miles an hour. And, to figure out what his velocity is, 35 times our conversion rate of 1.466. That's going to give us a velocity at impact for Rick of 51.31 feet per second. And we're also going to fill in some more blanks up here for for Carl. We're going to say that he has a walking speed of 3.5 miles an hour, which would give him a walking velocity of 3.5 times 1.466 of 5.13 feet per second. So we have a basic situation here to where we went out of the scene and we've been able to gather some evidence. And that's where some of these numbers are going to come from. Maybe we used a Searle, or we used some kind of formula that we figured out that the speed of the vehicle was 35 miles an hour when he was struck. We've measured with scene evidence. We've been able to identify where the impact point was, and we know that it was 12 feet from the curb. And, maybe we had a witness that told us which way Rick was walking from or whatever else, or Carl, and we know that he was 12 feet from the curb when he got struck. And then from there, we can do some walking speed studies or check with published numbers, things like that. And that's how we can fill in the 3.5 miles per hour and the 5.13 feet per second. All right. And just for the intents and purposes of this little exercise, we're going to say that this street that this occurs on has a 30 mile per hour speed limit. So what we had to wind up doing is we need to figure out what kind of budget constraints that the vehicle is operating within. And to do that, we're going to have to take some information from Carl and then figure out what Rick in the SUV has to spend. All right, so there's a lot of different things that people, could share possibly in a crash. They could possibly share speed. They could be going the same speed. They could have came from the same direction. All right, you could also have a situation to where maybe they came from the same distance. And they're also going to share the same time, or could share the same time. Now, for our example here, they don't share the same speed, because we know Carl is walking at 3.5 miles per hour, or 5.13 feet per second, and Rick is driving 35 miles per hour, or 51.31 feet per second. So they don't share speed together. We also know that Carl came from the curb, and he is kind of walking into the path of the vehicle. They're going two different directions. We know that Carl only came, a total distance of 12 feet. The SUV is going to come from a further distance, so they're not going to share a distance in common either. So one thing that they will share in common is going to be time. So we need to start remembering that the only two things usually that the two vehicles, or the two drivers, or the driver and the pedestrian, or the driver and the cyclist, the only thing they're really going to share together is going to be time. And we're going to use the time from one to figure out the distance for the other. All right, and a lot of people start to get a little confused right here. They realize that they share time together, but they kind of get confused on how to back up this SUV or this driver. They know they need to back him up, but they kind of get a little confused on how to do that. So for this example, we're going to make a couple of assumptions. And the first assumption is that Carl is going to drive or walk with a uniform constant speed of 3.5 miles per hour, which is usually a pretty safe assumption for your pedestrians. And we're going to say that Rick doesn't have any indication whatsoever that anything was wrong. He didn't try to react. There's no braking, there's no steering, there's nothing, and we're going to assume that he's going a constant speed of 35 miles per hour as he approaches that crash scene. And we've looked at CDR reports and everything. That's also usually a pretty safe assumption to make in most of your crashes. Most drivers are going to kind of sit there and they're going to go at the same speed as they approach that crash scene, unless they see something, they're slowing down, they're accelerating, whatever that case may be. But usually, without any kind of indication of a response, it's not an unsafe assumption to say that he's going to be approaching this crash scene at that constant speed of 35 miles per hour. So I'm just going to kind of draw in Rick back here somewhere. I don't quite know where he was just yet, but I can figure that out. And I'm going to need to figure that out to kind of help me figure out if the crash would or would not have occurred under different variables. All right, to solve where Rick is going to be, I need to account for the time that it took Carl to walk from the curb to impact. And the way I'm going to do that is with just a simple time formula. If I'm assuming that he's going that constant speed of 5.13 feet per second, then to solve for this is just as easy as saying time is equal to distance divided by velocity. So his time is equal to his distance of 12 feet divided by his velocity of 5.13 feet per second. So when I do that, when I say 12 divided by 5.13, I come up with a time of 2.33 seconds. All right, so now I know that it took Carl 2.33 seconds to walk from the curb to impact. Since Carl and the driver, or Rick, since they both share those 2.33 seconds in common, I need to find out where Rick was 2.33 seconds prior to the crash. So basically, I need to account for his movements leading up to that impact point. And I've also said that I'm going to assume that Rick was at that constant speed of 35 miles per hour. So to figure out what distance he would travel in that time interval that I was able to get from the pedestrian, how long it took Carl to walk from the curb to impact, to account for this, that is just as easy as saying distance is equal to velocity times time. So distance is going to be equal to, 51.31 feet per second times 2.33 seconds. So when I say 51.31 times 2.33, I'm going to come up with a distance of 119.55 feet. So now I've kind of solved for that. I've said that Rick is 119.55 feet from impact, 2.33 seconds prior to the crash when Carl stepped from the curb. Now the reason I picked Carl is because somebody had to kick this event off. And it doesn't really matter who's at fault, who's not at fault. This could have been in a crosswalk. Carl could have had the right of way. But it is whoever kicked the event off and put the event in motion. If Carl had not walked out into the road, Rick wouldn't have struck him. It's just like a vehicle turning left in front of somebody. If they hadn't turned left in front of somebody, that vehicle wouldn't have struck the other car. If Carl, right or wrong, hadn't stepped in the roadway, the wreck wouldn't have occurred. So that's why we use Carl's time that it takes him to walk from the curb to impact to figure out all our variables for Rick. So now Rick has up to 119.55 feet that we're going to work with. Second thing we want to do is the first thing, we just want to find out where Rick is. And we did that. We know that he's 2.33 seconds prior to the crash, and he's 119.55 feet from impact. The other thing we want to do is we want to figure out what Carl needs to not get hit. So at 12 feet, he got struck. So let's say that we went out, we did some vehicle measurements, or we did some roadway measurements, and let's say that at 16 feet, Carl would have been on the other side of the vehicle and he wouldn't have got struck. So I just need to figure out how much time Carl needs. I'm still going to assume that he's traveling at that constant, uniform, and average speed. So I'm just going to come here and I'm going to do this same equation over again. I'm going to say time is equal to distance divided by velocity. So time is equal to 16 divided by 5.13. So to be safe, to be clear from impact, Carl needs a total time of 3.11 seconds. So if he can get those 3.11 seconds from Rick, then he's going to be safe. The wreck isn't going to occur. So that's where kind of the negotiation part of it comes into, to kind of think about that. Carl is telling Rick, hey, I need 3.11 seconds. So to kind of think about this, you can kind of picture, the guy from Pawn Stars. All right, everybody's seen Pawn Stars. So just to kind of help you think about what we're doing, we've got Carl. He comes into Rick's pawn shop. He's trying to negotiate the price for something, and he says, hey, Rick, I need 3.11 seconds to get safely across the street and out of your vehicle's path of travel. All right, he probably wouldn't really talk like that, but he'd say, hey, but I need 3.11 seconds so you don't run me over. Now, the second part of this is, now that we figure out what Carl needs, we've got to see if Rick is going to be able to give that to him. And to figure out if that crash is still going to happen, we've got to do just a little bit more math to figure out if Rick is going to be able to give Carl what he's wanting. All right, so we're going to draw Carl back in up here. And now we know that Carl needs 3.11 seconds to not get hit. And we know that in the original crash, the driver, or Rick, was only able to give Carl those 2.33 seconds. So the wreck still happened. That was like Steve earlier going into Best Buy and trying to buy the $700 computer and only having $600 to spend. Rick only had 2.33 seconds to spend, but Carl needed 3.11 seconds. So there was a time deficit, and the wreck still happened. So the original crash occurred because basically Rick's card got declined at the register. Think about it that way. So now let's see if there is something that Carl could do to increase that time a little bit. So we know that in the original crash, Rick had 2.33 seconds. That wasn't enough, so we need to increase this time a little bit. So how are we going to get this time raised? And one of the things you're going to look at in just about every crash is to see if speed is a factor. And most of the crashes you investigate are going to be for that reason exactly. You want to see if speed is a factor in the crash. So we looked at it earlier, and we said that Rick was going 35 miles per hour at impact. And we also know that the speed limit was 30 miles per hour. So now let's see if he would have came back into the crash at 30 miles per hour, could he have picked up enough time and negotiate with Carl to see if that wreck wouldn't happen? So we're going to kind of draw Rick back in here. Another part people always get a little bit confused at is they don't quite know what distance to use. And we're always going to use that original distance to impact from the original crash. So we're not going to take that away from him. he had 119.55 feet, and he will always have 119.55 feet available to him any way that we look at this. We're not going to add to or take away from his feet or his distance to impact. We're just going to see if he would have done something a little bit differently. Could he have used those 119.55 feet a little bit better? And the thing that we're kind of isolating for this crash is if he would have came in at 30 miles per hour, would the crash still have happened? So we've got Rick now. We're going to say that he's going at a speed of 30 miles per hour with the speed limit. And that's going to put him in a velocity of 43.98 feet per second. We've still got Carl. And the time he needs is 3.11 seconds. So to figure this out, we need to see if Rick is going to be able to give Carl the time that he needs at the slower speed. We're still going to assume and make the same assumption that he's coming in at a constant, uniform, and average speed. We're still going to make the same assumption that Carl is walking at a constant 3.5 miles per hour and that Rick is driving in at a constant 30 miles per hour because that's what happened in the original crash. So we just need to see if at the slower speed, is that going to be enough time for Carl to safely be able to be out of the way of that vehicle. So we're still just going to use that basic constant, uniform, and average formula to figure out what his time is. So for Rick, we're just going to say time is equal to distance divided by velocity. So time is equal to 119.55 feet divided by 43.98 feet per second. And when we run the math on this, 119.55 divided by 43.98, that is going to give us a time of 2.71 seconds. So does the crash still happen? We're just going to set up our problem, or our subtraction problem, to see. We have Rick with 2.71 seconds. We have Carl that needs 3.11 seconds. So if we subtract the 2.71 that Rick is trying to spend minus the 3.11 that it cost, he's still short because we've came up with a negative 0.4 of a second. So Rick's card got declined again, and the wreck still happened. They couldn't get together and they couldn't negotiate a better outcome of the wreck at 30 miles per hour, which was the speed limit. And we may could take that down lower and see where he would have gotten the extra time. But for this crash, at least if Rick had reapproached the scene from the same point, the 119.55 feet away, just as in the original crash, but now he comes in at a little bit slower of a speed. He comes in at 30 instead of 35. Basically, the crash still happens. They get back together and they're trying to do their negotiation again. And now Rick from Pawn Stars tells Carl, best I can do is hit you slower. Maybe it won't cause as much damage, but the wreck still happened. So that is pretty much a easy way to kind of think about this in terms of money and surpluses of time or deficits of time, surpluses of distance or deficits of distance, because you can work those either way. But if you kind of think about somebody going in and trying to make a purchase, the driver and the other driver, the driver and the pedestrian, and the driver and the motorcyclist kind of getting together and doing some kind of a negotiation, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of comprehend this stuff and explain it and work it out. Okay, everybody, that is a wrap for episode 2, Time and Distance. It's in the bank. I certainly hope you got some good information, some stuff that you can use in your careers to help you move forward in your investigations. and things like that. So, hey, if you got some value out of it, be sure to share it with some of your colleagues that you think could benefit from it. And also, if you're watching this on the YouTube version, why don't you give the video a like, maybe subscribe to the channel. That way, you will be notified if you turn notifications on, of course, when the next episodes drop and things like that. So we've got a lot more stuff that is planned that should be coming down the pipe here pretty soon. Also, why it's fresh on your brain while we're in this whole COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of training is being so hard to come by, especially in a lot of areas that are harder hit than other ones. While you're thinking about it, why don't you head over to crashtrainingsolutions.com/bundle. That's crashtrainingsolutions.com/bundle. And you can see on that webpage how you can get 4 great full-length reconstruction courses and pay the price of what you would with the other guys for a single course. This isn't any kind of old, out-of-date stuff. These are brand new programs that we're just now starting to push out as part of this 2020-2021 kind of grand opening thing for Crash Training Solutions. So be sure to check that out. And also, if you're listening to this where you get your audio podcast and you want to be able to see, what I was talking about visually, or even if you're looking at this on YouTube and you just want to have the visuals to save and refer back to later if you'd like, head over to crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast. crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast. You can download the visuals from today's episode, and you'll also see a way that you can submit questions that you'd like to see answered here on the podcast. Getting a lot of really good questions, a lot of really good things that we've got coming up on the podcast here in the next few weeks. So, of course, the more questions we get in from you guys in the field, the more often we'll be able to do the podcast, and the better it's going to be and more beneficial to everyone. So again, I appreciate you listening. Thanks a lot, and I will see you guys out on the road.